We are very pleased to welcome Loring Knoblauch as tonight's guest speaker. Loring is the founder and publisher of Collector Daily and has been an active fine art photography collector for more than 15 years. Collector Daily offers a daily mix of gallery, museum, and photo book reviews, worldwide auction previews, art fair summaries, and opinion commentary, all from the perspective of a passionate photography collector. In 2012, the predecessor site DLK Collection was named one of the top photo blogs by British Journal of Photography and Wired. Beyond his photography activities, Loring has had a successful career as both a technology startup entrepreneur and as a venture capital investor. Most recently, his projects have included an early-stage nanotechnology investment fund and an entrepreneur-in-resident post at the University of Connecticut. He holds a BA from Middlebury College and an MBA from Stanford University. So please help me welcome Loring to our lecture series.
So I'm a little bit of an outlier. You've seen nothing, it seems to me, in your list of speakers, you've seen a lot of photographers tell you about their work and walk you through sort of picture by picture, I'm sure, the evolution of their thinking. So I'm a collector. I sit at the very other end of the spectrum from artists, and I have become a writer and a critic over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, mostly as a way to think about collecting or to process collecting. Writing about photography was a way for me to think about it and understand it. As Jaime said, my wife and I have been collecting for the past 15 or 20 years now. I started my life in photography. My mother was a photographer. And so I grew up, there was a darkroom in our basement. We lived in Minnesota. So I spent a lot of time watching that 60-second clock go around and agitating the developer trays and sitting on a stool and trying to stay out of the way. And so we always have, there was a lot of photography around our house, and my mother went to a lot of workshops in the summertime. We went, and so whether it was Minor White or Frank Golke or Jerry Uelsman or any of those sort of 70s folks who were doing workshops, I would hang around those places, and there are pictures of me in a box, like Ruth Bernhard's in a box, and there's pictures of me, of writing writing a story on a photograph like Allen Ginsberg's, and sort of all these exercises that were done at that time. And so that's sort of how I got into photography. And so when I had my first apartment, my mother said, you can take a few pictures from whatever's not hanging on the wall, and she had a bunch of pictures that she had traded or bought or acquired over the years from various photographers. And so that's how we started out with photography, my wife and I. And then, as we sort of got to the point in our lives where we could afford to buy a few pictures ourselves, we started our own collection and started to buy things that we were interested rather than sort of what we had received or a sort of derived opinion of my parents of what was interesting. And so the rest is sort of history. We've been actively at it now for 15, 20 years, and we have a fairly significant collection that we've built up. And I think what's also happened is that I've gotten deeper and deeper and deeper into photography. At this point in my life, I spend 2 days a week looking at galleries. I probably visit 20 to 30 shows a week of photography in and around New York. I saw 8 shows today before I came here. And I do this every week. I go to the Lower East Side, I go to Midtown, I go to Chelsea, I wander out into the boroughs, and I try to see everything. As crazy as that sounds as a kind of a way to lead your life, that's what I try to do. I try to see everything. When we first started collecting, I tried to see things that I was interested in. And then I think I started to figure out that that was a pretty narrow way to do things because you just saw exactly what you expected to see. And so I'm constantly trying to go to things that I know I'm not going to like, or I think I'm not going to like. And I'm always surprised, of course. And so that's sort of been my thing, is I try to just see everything. that I can. Even, everything from the obvious museum show that we're all going to see to the first solo that not many of us are going to see. And try to think about it and process it and sort of put it in a context. And as you'll see as we go through this, I'm a fairly systematic thinker. And so I'm always trying to figure out where these things fit on a map, where a photographer fits, where a body of work fits. And so, you can say I'm kind of an addict at this point. Go ahead. Sure.
Wait, okay. I'm live tweeting your go see everything. Good.
It's life.
Do you list gallery exhibit commentaries on your blog?
So
Of
yeah,
the
I'll
shows that
talk
you
about
see?
that in a second. But yeah, I review gallery shows, I review museum shows, I review photo books, I review art fairs, I review auctions, both preview and results. And I'll explain why I do all those things, because they actually all fit together, I think. So let me, without further ado, let's go to the first diagram I'm going to give you of many tonight. There's not very many photographs tonight, a lot of diagrams. The reason I'm putting this diagram up is to try to explain to you the distance between what I think most of you are, which is photographers or artists, and collectors, and how far I am from you. And what these bubbles are trying to explain is that the closer something is to you, the more control you have over it and how it portrays your work. So if you've got your own website, that's about the best you can do in terms of having something that you as an artist can display your work the way you want to display it. And then you move a little further, and if you've got a gallery partner or a book, and we'll talk a little bit about both of these, you can you have some degrees of freedom in your ability to show your work the way you want to show it, but you've got to make some compromises here. As you get down to a museum show, you might not have very much control at all. And as you get further into auctions and art fairs, you've lost control entirely. And now your work is floating around in the world and is to be determined, kind of what the market or what the public or what the greater universe thinks of that work. And then further is you have all the filtered interpretations. Your reviews, your criticism, your journalism, your entertainment, who is talking about photography, talking about what's happening in all these things. And there I am, way over there. And so I'm looking back at you, and I'm looking through all these layers. And so part of what I want to tell you is I hardly ever see you. I hardly ever talk to you. And Jaime and I were talking about this a little bit. I don't talk to artists very often. When I have my collector hat on, that's a lot of fun. It's fun to talk to artists. It's fun to listen and learn and exchange ideas. When I have my writer hat on, it's very awkward because I may be a critic. I may be a naysayer. And so it becomes a little bit complicated to have relationships with artists if I'm a critic. And so depending on which hat I've got on, I've got to play a little bit of a different role. And so, I'm going to show you one more here. And so my view is, think of this as like a window. And I'm looking through this window at you, and you're on the other side. But I don't actually see you ever. I see museums, I see galleries, I see art fairs, I see books, I see auctions, but this is all I ever see. And so I have to come to a conclusion about your work based on what I see here. Not on your artist statement, not on what you might think, what you might have intended, but what is presented to me as a collector. And so I think that's important for you to understand because it's not, it isn't as simple as you might think, and that you need to actively try to control some of these things, I think. And we'll talk a little about that in a minute. But I think these intermediate, I see your, and depending on which prism I look through, I might see your work differently. And so that I think is sort of interesting. And that's part of why, as a collector, and the way I've built Collector Daily as a site that talks about collecting, is that you got to talk about all of these pieces to have any understanding of what's really going on. Because if I just go to the galleries, and I never look at a photo book, and I never look at what's going on in the auctions, or I never go to a museum, or I just don't want to fly to Miami to go to an art fair, I'm only getting a piece of the universe. And I can't, again, it's hard for me to create that context in my head of how things fit together in the entire universe of fine art photography if I only look through one prism. And even if I go to every gallery show that's on view in New York in a year, I'm still missing a huge universe of all the shows that were happening in Milan, or that were happening in Paris, or that were happening in Tokyo or Shanghai or Caracas. And so, again, it takes a while for shows to filter their way to New York. Work that gets made in Italy in 2008 finally gets to New York in 2013. It takes time, and so you have these sets of delays. And so maybe I'll see that work in an art fair before I'll see it in a gallery show. Or maybe, conceivably, I'll even see it at an auction before I see it in a gallery show. And so part of what I'm trying to do is take all these pieces of information and puzzle them together to figure out what's actually going on in fine art photography. And I still don't have it all, but I got a lot of it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through each of what I think is going on in these areas. We'll talk a little bit about photography in each one, or specific photography, and then at the end I want to talk about some collecting stuff too. So what's happening in the gallery world? We're in a time of significant change in the gallery world. And if you're an emerging photographer, or a new photographer, or even a fairly well-established photographer, you need to understand this, because it's going to impact the way you go to market with your product, with your art. What's happened in the last 5-10 years is you had a professionalization of what used to be a high-touch cottage industry. It used to be that a gallery was half a dozen people, one space. The gallery director would walk out and talk to you, and it would be as a collector, a very high-touch interactive sell. They know a lot about the work. We're interacting on a personal basis. It's a very interactive process. And that business, while it still exists, and we'll talk about it in a second of how it's kind of being reinvented, that business, probably now full of MBAs like myself, has changed. And there's a new tier of galleries, big mega galleries that have multiple spaces all over the world, huge staff, huge investment in books, in PR, in marketing, in fairs, and that creates a big burn rate economically in terms of the amount of money they're spending. The biggest galleries in the world have burn rates that are in the tens of millions of dollars on an annual basis, 10, 20, 30, 50. 100 people on staff, spaces in a dozen countries. This is a big, 60, 70 artists in the stable. That's a big operation. And that kind of a burn rate, that kind of spending on a monthly basis, the rent, the everything, that requires selling high-priced art, because you can't get there from here in terms of breaking even as a business unless you're selling enough high-priced art to cover your costs at a minimum, much less have a successful sort of profitable business. So what does that say? So it says if you're that big gallery, you've got to be selling art that's $50,000 and up, maybe more, and you've got to sell a lot of it. And so what does that say about artists? Well, now what that says is I got to have the right kind of artists. I got to have bankable artists. I got to have name brand artists. I got to have artists I can show at an art fair and I can sell a bunch of. And so what's happening is those big galleries are poaching the quote-unquote best, and best is not the right word, but the most bankable artists from the mid-tier galleries. The problem with that is that those mid-tier galleries have grown those artists from the ground up, from when they were like you folks, when you didn't, you weren't anybody famous yet, and you needed to do 2 or 3 or 4 shows in a row to figure out who you were as an artist and refine your approach and find that kind of magic. And so they invested all that money, all that time, and finally, of the 12 in their stable, they got 1 or 2 that are actually singing and having a great success, and those are the ones that are getting picked off, leaving them with the 8 others who are still struggling and haven't quite found their way. And so those mid-tier galleries are now, think about your place as a mid-tier gallery owner, you're kind of in a tough spot because you've got a decent sized burn as a mid-tier gallery, 1 space, 2 space, maybe big, maybe got 10, 20 people on staff, and suddenly your best cash cow gallery, cash car artist has been picked off by one of these big guys. So now you're stuck a little bit. And this is where we are. This is what's happening right now. And so what's happening is that these mid and smaller galleries are having to reinvent themselves and come up with new models for how they're dealing with artists and how they're growing their business. And you see colonizing of new neighborhoods. Chelsea has been overrun by bigger and bigger spaces. You go see the huge Hauser and Wirth space on 18th Street. Those are massive spaces, and the rents are going sky high. So all the small galleries are being pushed out, and they're going to the Lower East Side, or they're going to Brooklyn. And so Chelsea is being, at some level, hollowed out, and some level professionalized, depending on your perspective. And so what you're going to see in that space are big galleries with big budgets and a certain kind of work. And so it's not going to be a place where risky, unexpected work that sells for $1,500 is going to be found anymore. It's going to be found in the Lower East Side and in Brooklyn and in other further afield places. And so this is what's happening. And so, grow or go has become kind of a catchword, at least among certain collectors and folks, on my side of the aisle, I guess, in terms of these galleries have to grow or go somewhere else because there isn't any other option. If they stay, they get poached and they fail. And so as you think about, obviously as a younger artist, you're not necessarily sort of parachuting into Zwirner or Gagosian or Marion Goodman. You're starting somewhere else. And you should just realize that this is the dynamic that is happening. And you should think about the stable you're joining when you join a gallery and who's in it and where they are in their career and how that might impact yours, actually, in terms of how these mid and smaller galleries are thinking about promoting artists, how they're doing their show. I mean, this is a different universe, and we're getting a 2-tiered universe now. And I think it's important to understand. This is a super simple diagram, and all I want to talk about is in the world of photography, specifically, there's 2 dynamics happening. One is you have the specialist photography galleries who have typically been vintage players. Your Greenberg, your Pace McGill, your Hauck, and others, who have sort of dominated those vintage areas for years now, and are leaking over into contemporary photography, are trying to add more contemporary photographers to their stables. It's hard for them. They don't always have the right space that's big enough. They don't always have the right vibe, but they're trying. And the other thing that's happening is you have your contemporary art galleries who are leaking down into doing more photography than they ever have done before. And I don't want to make this, I'm not trying to make a distinction between art and photography here because they're the same thing in my book, but give me this for just the purpose of illustration. They're leaking down. And so if you go to an art fair, what you'll find, like you go to Miami, there's jillions of contemporary art galleries, and there's one photographer or two photographers in each table. And so these galleries don't necessarily come from a vintage photography mindset. They don't, and when you walk into a booth and talk about a Thomas Struth in Marion Goodman, you're not getting a story about how Thomas Struth sits in the context of vintage photography. You're getting a story about how Thomas Struth fits in the context of contemporary art. And that's a different perspective. And so again, whether we're in large galleries or small galleries, whether we're in a small specialist photography gallery or a small contemporary art gallery, there's a clash that's kind of happening here in terms of approach. And so again, if you're an emerging photographer, you got to ask yourself, do I want to join a specialist photography gallery, or do I want to join a contemporary art gallery? Even if that might be, even if both of those galleries are new, fresh, exciting places, they're going to come with different mindsets. And they're going to come with different approaches, and they're going to take your work different places. Show it in different fairs. And that's, again, this dynamic is going to continue to happen. I think there's going to be more overlap. And maybe that overlap will go away. I mean, this distinction I'm drawing will vanish eventually.
I was wondering if, by extension, when you visited Miami, for instance, in the contemporary art galleries that had one or two photographers, were they even local photographers to where the galleries came from, or
No.
are those just
Not even remotely.
international?
I mean, I'm going to talk about Miami in a minute, but what was on view in Miami was name brand photographers. All of them international. I mean, it doesn't matter whether Ryan McGinley is from New York or Elgar Esser is from Germany. They're in this strata of sort of bankable artists that and again, they may be in multiple galleries. There may be, there's a gallery from Brazil and a gallery from France and a gallery from the US all showing the same work. It's all Wolfgang Tillmans everywhere. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. Merchandise, yes. So part of why this is happening, I think, is that in this diagram I had, go ahead.
You were just talking about one photographer being with multiple galleries.
Uh-huh.
Are all those galleries under one umbrella?
Typically what happens is that there is effectively a master relationship. There is one gallery who is the dominant and who provides the registrar function, which is basically an inventory management system. So that gallery, makes sure, understands where every single print went, and tracks all that stuff and does all the sort of back office management. And then the other affiliated galleries are basically like sales offices. So, there's a sales office in Rio that's selling Elgar Esser. There's a main gallery, maybe in New York, maybe in Europe, that is kind of the dominant one, and work is being farmed out to collectors out there and, fed out there based on demand. So it's not like it's never a sort of group of equals. There's always sort of one in control and others that are somewhat subservient to the main gallery management. So part of why I think this is happening is that it used to be, in the simplistic old world, that our worlds were very separate, and that analog photography, while it overlapped with painting or sculpture or performance or film and video a little bit, and there were some, there's photography of performance, and there's documentation of sculpture, and there's interaction here. There's painterly photography, okay, and sort of overpainting and other things going on. This used to be relatively separate. It used to be relatively kind of walled off. And that's why you had specialist photography galleries that were separate from the contemporary art galleries, is because they didn't really overlap ever. And they were two separate worlds. And I think what's happened is we're now in the digital revolution has blown those barriers to hell. And we're now in a place where everything is overlapping. And so digital photography is now like this beast that's just sucking everything else around it into the center circle. It's getting bigger and bigger, and all these things over here also got sucked in along the way. So we have, and what's happening is that, and I imagine if I sat and talked to those of you here who are artists in this program, you're probably not in this little white center doing photography that's photography. You're probably doing digital photography that is part sculpture and part stock photography and maybe a little bit of Google Earth. And it's all mixed together in some mashup that we still call photography because it's output as a photographic print or in some manner that's quasi-photographic. But it's actually kind of this hybrid of all different kinds of art. And that's why all the contemporary art galleries are falling into this bucket now, and why many of the artists that we think are exciting are contemporary artists rather than being in the photography bubble or photography ghetto. They're now out in this bigger universe. And so I think this is super exciting. I think you guys are like at the best possible, in a certain way, the best possible time in terms of being in a program and kind of finding your way in the art world, because I think there is so much white space now that didn't used to be there in terms of your options. I come from a technology, software engineer kind of brain. And so I'm totally interested in photographers who are engineers, who are writing code, and who are thinking about glitches and machine engineering and twisting and turning and using software as a means of manipulating photography. That's super interesting to me. That didn't exist, a few years ago. At least again, from my vantage point as a collector. It may have existed in the artist's mind, but hasn't gotten all the way out to me yet until recently. And that it hasn't actually gotten all the way out to to those mega galleries. It's still in the emerging and mid galleries. It hasn't actually reached, if we look at what's shown in Miami, it's not this. It's not this compendium of different ideas. It's still fairly traditional large format photography. And so we're on the cusp of really changing how that happens. What's accepted, what's interesting, what's exciting. And so I think there are lots and lots of, in the world of venture capital, you're investing in little tiny ideas and companies, and you're always trying to figure out what could go right. We've all been trained, especially us analytical types, to pick stuff apart, figure out what could go wrong. It's actually really easy to look at a body of work, look at a photographer's work and say, I know exactly what's going wrong here. It's relatively straightforward. The question is can you look at a body of work and figure out what could go right here? We can fix all the stuff that's broken. What could go right? And so I'm going to, it would be unfair of me to stand here and not give you some names. These are some photographers. Some of them, it doesn't take a genius to say that Thomas Roof or Paul Graham or Rinneke Dijkstra might have a good idea up his or her sleeve. But what I'm trying to say here is I think that this is a group of photographers where I think there's some exciting stuff gonna happen. It may have happened already for some of them. It may be happening for some of them in process. It may be on the cusp. And there's a whole nother group, which if we had more time, I would dive into a layer even less well known than this bunch, who you probably are friends with and are all in their 20s or early 30s. That group, that's even more radical, even more interdisciplinary. Not all of these folks are interdisciplinary. Some of them are. Some of them are combining, twisting, but some of them are still pretty traditional photographers. But I think what I want you to come away with is not, do you think Kate Hardy is interesting? Because I do, but maybe you don't, and whatever. I think the way you ought to think about new photographers is not, am I interested in what I see before me? But you ought to be thinking about what could go right. And I know that's kind of a forward-looking, weird way to think about things, but as a collector, that's what I'm doing. I'm tracking these photographers and many, many more, and I'm saying, Mariah Robertson. I don't know if you saw Mariah Robertson's recent show down at American Contemporary in Lower East Side. Big, wild abstractions done in the darkroom, very expressive, very interesting. And so she's already made interesting work, but I think there's a nugget there of something more, of something like, wow, this is somebody we ought to be tracking. We ought to be thinking about, we ought to be watching, because as she gets more complicated, as she gets more refined, this could be really interesting. And so that's kind of what that's what I'm trying to peel out of my weekly trips to the galleries. So I'm trying to go through and I'm trying to see work and I'm trying to say, who's got something going on and who isn't? And there's a ton of work that doesn't. But we're starting to see more, especially in this interdisciplinary area where we're getting a lot of crossovers and cross-pollinations, and that's really interesting to me. So back to Art Miami for a second. So as I said before, there was a ton of evidence, and I was saying to Jaime that maybe I'm a little bit jaded because I went to 9 fairs this year. And so I've seen a lot of fairs, and I've seen a lot of kind of how galleries are presenting themselves and what kind of work they're showing. And this show for me was very obviously full of new work from established names. Struth, Muniz, Esser, Tillmans, Demand, Hofer, Kesper, Etheridge, McGinley, and many more. It's sort of work that could be sold and was by somebody you'd heard of and you knew you wanted as a collector, but you weren't sure quite why. Especially if you didn't know very much about photography. So, there was some increasing dispersion of photography across the exhibitors, meaning there were more booths with photography than ever before. And I think that's good, and more international booths with photography. But again, I think we're seeing a split in the market between this top tier and the rest of the market. And risky stuff is getting crowded out. At least in a fair like this. And so, that's hard. You don't really notice that unless you kind of look at the whole fair. But there's not a lot of risk-taking going on. And it led me to the question of, will collectors become bifurcated as well? And I think the answer is they already kind of are. And that certain collectors are buying this kind of work. And there are other collectors who are interested in crazy, forward-looking, non-obvious photography, and those two groups don't mix very much. And they don't necessarily even have the same vocabulary. And so galleries and artists and everyone's going to have to get a little bit better at signaling to collectors who they are so we can understand. And once again, international photography is still underrepresented, constantly underrepresented. I feel like I never know enough. I never know enough about African photography. I never know enough about even Japanese photography, which one knows a decent amount about. there's just constantly, we know so much about what's happening in the New York art world because we see all these shows, from first solos or second, from people that have grown up in this environment, but we don't see them from the Chinese market or the Middle Eastern markets. What do we know about Iranian photography? Not as much as we should. And so I feel like, but this fair is not a place to find any of that. But it's a great place to find a beautiful new Thomas Struth if that's what you want. And not to say that isn't perfectly fabulous. It is. But it's a different, it's a certain kind of animal, I guess is what I'm trying to get across to you. Oh, not too far. So I wanted to just, again, I'm going to go, this is the museum piece of the puzzle. And I want you to think about what shows we saw in 2013 here in New York. So at the Met, you saw the Civil War show, which is fabulous. Julia Margaret Cameron, which is fabulous. William Eggleston, which is fabulous. And Everyday Epiphanies, which was boring. Bill Brandt was excellent. Walker Evans, we'd seen it before, but pretty good. New photography, we'll come back to that. XL, that's just like whatever's, just showed up. Not hugely insightful, I didn't think. And I could go through this on and on. But what I would say is that, again, if you're an emerging photographer or a young photographer, aside from the Triennial, which I thought was fabulous, you have there's nothing going on for you in the museum world except learning about what has already been established and historically significant by somebody else's measure. It's safe to reconsider the already successful. And I think we're seeing that here in our museums, unfortunately, and we're going to continue to see it. You look at, I'm just flipping through here because I want to get my list of what's coming in 2014. We've got Charles Marville, which will be great, but 19th century photography. Winogrand is coming to the Met. And then MoMA has Heineken, which will be good, I think quite interesting. And then Christopher Williams. And then we have a new big kind of rehanging of the permanent collection, which is focused on studio practices. Again, potentially sort of interesting. But I don't feel like our museums are, down here, consolidating reputations, not igniting them. That's what our museums are doing. And I don't think we're seeing a lot of risk-taking. I don't think, as a collector, what did I see here that I didn't already know at some level? I love Bill Brandt. We'll talk about Bill Brandt in a little bit, and it was a great show. The Room of Nudes was one of the great experiences in photography this year. But I'm not sure that it wasn't something that you haven't seen already, if you're kind of in and around this world at all. So again, as a collector looking through that mirror, that sort of stained glass window, great to see these things, but they're not influencing the way I think about photography very much. On the other hand, if I was you, I would make a book.
It's required to graduate.
Is it?
Yes.
Good. Because, Jaime and I were talking about this before. I don't know whether it was, Par Badger and sort of teaching people about what the sort of merit of photography books that had been sort of forgotten or overlooked over the years, or whether it's just digital technology and the cost, the pure cost differential and sort of way that we can now build books that we never used to be able to build them. We have so many self-publishers, so many small publishers, so much flowering. I can tell you as a collector, while I have a pretty big library of photo books, 5 years ago I was not paying attention to this at all. I mean, I had a bunch of books, and I was dog-earing them, and I was looking at, I'm interested in these pictures, and they're all monographs of famous photographers. Now I am literally trying to dig out all the weirdo zines and newspapers and pamphlets that I can find. This is the way I am discovering photography, of people that I don't know. I go to I go to Dashwood, I go to the ICP, I go to Printed Matter, I go to, art book fairs, and I buy books of people that I've never heard of. So for me as a collector, I think suddenly I'm super energized, and I'm writing about books too, because I think it's a way to, again, spread the word. And so if I was a young photographer, unrepresented, or even mid-career, I think it's a way to communicate, and it's one where you have a ton of control. You can make your pitch to me as a collector, or me or the broader public, in a much more, sort of way that you want, way that you feel shows off your ideas in the best possible manner. So I think this is super exciting. We've been reviewing books on Collector Daily for a while, but we're going to review a lot more. Again, from first-time publishers, from self-published, from international. We're trying, we're really digging. It's not that we reviewed the Emmett Gowan monograph, we reviewed Joseph Kudelka's Wall. Yeah, okay. But let's dig into these kind of other ones where some of this interdisciplinary photography that we've talked about before is being shown, because it's not yet in the galleries entirely. So we got to find a place to see it and interact with it and learn about it and figure out a sort of a conceptual framework for how we're going to understand it. And so these books are the way to do it. So I'm super glad you guys are making books.
I just want to add, I don't need mic. I just think it's interesting now to watch Kickstarter and these self-funding sites to really find who's really new and desperate.
Yeah, so personally, I have not funded a lot of Kickstarter random, books. I have not given $50 and taken a free book or a free poster or a free T-shirt or whatever it was. That seems pretty far afield for me as a collector, given where I am in that continuum. I can understand how if I was a photographer and I got my friends and neighbors and people I know to fund me, I get that as a way of sort of finding dollars. If you can't sort of rub two nickels together yourself, you got to find that money somewhere, and it isn't free, even as a self-publisher. And the distribution isn't obvious, and there's a whole bunch of. As you guys well know, if you're making books, this is a non-trivial problem that we're talking about. I mean, you're making a book and distributing it isn't nothing, even with all of the advances we've had in the last 5 to 10 years. But I do think I do feel like the options, the doors have been opened, and there's a lot. As I said before, there's a lot of white space now. You don't have to make a book the way you used to had to make it, and that's really exciting. And to be honest, I could hardly be more excited about that than anything else, because it's a way to discover photography for collectors. And you ought to think about, how do I get books in the hands of collectors? And whether you give it to them or you sell it to them or you whatever, it's marketing materials. Sorry to kind of say it that way, but that's what it is. All right, so here's a good question for you. Anybody know what these 10 photographs are? You can probably identify them, but do you know what connects them? Can you identify them? Gursky, Sherman, Struth. So these are the top 10 lots at auction this year. And I didn't show you this because I'm impressed by the numbers, or you should be impressed by the numbers, or you should even really care about the dollars. But I think there's some interesting things, and I'm going to talk in a second about why I think auctions are important to be watching. So what do we see here? First of all, you have this weird outlier Coons, which is a Duratrans light box. You could argue whether it's it depends on whose definition of photography we're using. But then we have lots of Gursky. While this looks like Rhine 2, it's actually Rhine 1. Rhine 2 is the most expensive, quote unquote, the most expensive photograph ever sold, and it was 4.3, I think. So this is a variant. These are stock exchanges, and that's Montparnasse, and this, I don't know, I think that's a boxing match. This is the centerfold. So what I want to say here is none of these are really are like blockbuster great works, I would argue. I'm a huge Gilbert and George fan of the early Gilbert and George, made prior to late 70s. This is a good one. I love, centerfold, hard to beat. A Cindy Sherman centerfold is a pretty fabulous thing. That's not the best one. A Cindy Sherman film still is a good thing, but that's not the best one, at least in my own sort of delusional world. So what I would say to you here is, these are all contemporary works. This isn't an Edward Weston nude. This isn't it's not even a Steichen pond. They're all big. But we don't have a bubble here. If you read the press, what you will read about is how we've got a crazy art market bubble going on here. And all, Francis Bacon and Andy Warhol and the recent Jeff Koons Balloon Dog. That's not what's happening in photography. These pictures, none of these are records. They're all, Cindy Sherman's centerfold, the best, the orange one, which you might recognize, that sold for like $3.5 million. So $2 million. I'm not saying it's not a lot of money. I'm not saying it couldn't change your life if you had that money, but it's not out of the realm of reality. It's not a bubble. It's not a wild outlier. None of these prices are wild outliers. They're not records. They're not, the Gurskys are big but not unexpected. So we're not seeing a frothy, crazy, speculative boom. We're seeing slow, growth, and prices are rising, but it's not what you might think. So I think what you got to understand about auction results and why it's important for you as an artist to think about them. The art market is opaque and imperfect and nearly completely illiquid. So, and photography is the same. So if I go to a Lower East Side gallery and I buy a piece of photography for $5,000, it's kind of like driving a car off a lot. I get the minute I'm outside the door, it's worth nothing, unless I can find who am I going to sell it to, and for what price will they buy it? Who knows? But it's certainly less than what I paid for it. And so the reason auction market results are interesting is they give us some public data points which we can match against what's happening in the galleries. And we can look at aggregate data to see patterns. And what I mean by that is, like what's been happening, if you look at recent auctions and you watch what's been happening to Francesca Woodman's prints, vintage prints, and there are a bunch of later prints that are not, this is not happening to, her prices have gone through the roof from, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, now regularly $50, $70, $100. So yes, we just had a retrospective a year or two ago. But that tells us something about demand. It tells us something about interest in her work. It tells us something about, that's just not two collectors fighting and being crazy on one day. That's a pattern. Same thing's happening for mid-career James Casebeer. Not the newest stuff, not the super early stuff, but where it becomes clear in his work that his constructions are becoming more complicated and more nuanced. It's the right work to be rising in price. Things are so you can look at this data and you can start to see patterns about what is in favor and what might be less in favor or going out of favor. And so again, as a piece of data, it can help us see momentum for ideas, momentum for styles of work, momentum for genres, in addition to momentum for specific artists or specific prints. Does this change the value of the art itself? No, it's unrelated. It's just it's a set of data points. But I think as a collector, I'm interested in those momentum trends, that sort of second derivative of the curve, of the rate of change, of what's happening to certain artists and why, not because I necessarily want to buy any more of that artist, but I'm sort of interested in intellectually of sort of how the market is fitting together and which boats are rising and which boats are falling, and what that might say about what we as a public think about art, what we as a group of collectors, how we behave. I think those are interesting questions, and I think they're worth thinking about. So I come from a world of technology startups. And what I would tell you is that I think you ought to think about yourself, if you're an artist, like you are the CEO of your own company, like you are the CEO of yourself. And what I would say is that all this stuff in blue is what you do. This is like an org chart of a typical technology startup. You're the VP of engineering. You're also the chief technology officer who comes up with all the brilliant ideas. And you're the VP of manufacturing. And you've got to figure out how to get your product built, whether you outsource it to some other studio or you have a bunch of minions that do it for you, or whether you do it yourself. You're all these things. You're in charge of strategy. You're in charge of making the decisions about your career. And all this other stuff, you're outsourcing to somebody else. I mean, and that's the way you ought to think about it. When you make a gallery partnership, you are giving them money to do this stuff for you. And the way you're doing it is by giving them half of the proceeds of whatever you sell. You are choosing your sales and marketing operation. And that's a different way to think about it. I mean, that's a different sort of, here I am hat in hand, and here's my portfolio, and please can I be in your stable. I think that's a different way to think about it, which is, hey, I am in charge of my art. And I'm hiring you, if you're good enough, to be my sales and distribution arm, to deal with customers, to deal with PR, to deal with IT, because there's sort of an inverse, at least from a collector's perspective, there's an inverse relationship between the website. The more famous you are, the less you have your own website. So Cindy Sherman doesn't have her own website. All emerging photographers have their own website. And so the more famous you get, the less likely you are to be making your own website. So you're likely to have somebody else do that for you. And all this back office crap of customer service and shipping and inventorying and all of that is being done by somebody else. You're hiring somebody to do it. And so, and what is a collector? Well, a collector is sort of a venture capitalist at the other end. I'm providing capital. I'm making investments in you by buying your work. I'm a supporter. I'm an advocate. I'm an evangelist. I'm out here saying I'm buying into this business, this activity. And that, you have to manage this stuff. It's not going to get, as much as you might like to think that you can hide in your studio and make work, you got to manage these people. I can tell you from knowing gallery owners, you got to be on top of them. You got to know what they're doing. You got to coach them on what to say. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a gallery, a first gallery, first solo, and talked to the gallery owner, and had the gallery owner not be able to articulate to me what this work is about. And then I go back, if I happen to know the artist, I go back and I say, listen, I talk to the to the gallery owner, and you got to go coach that person because they are the first line of sales. And if they cannot articulate what your art is about in 30 seconds in a compelling manner, then you got a problem. You got to be able. They need to be able to kind of express what's exciting and energizing about your work, and what it's related to, and how it fits. And they need to be able to do that. And if your gallery can't do that for you, then you need to, that's your fault. You got to go fix that. And I think that's an eye-opener for a lot of artists. That you're in charge here. As much as it feels like you might not be, and you feel like you're always waiting for someone else to make that choice or give you that validation, I think you got to think that you're in charge. You got to act like you're in charge. And you got to make those decisions yourself. Let me talk a little bit about the dreaded moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Collector Daily, and then we'll talk 2 minutes about collecting. The dreaded moment of silence. So the show is hung, the announcement cards are sent, the press release is out, the doors are open, and then no response at all. Where we are in New York is we have New York Times. Doesn't cover emerging photography at all. I mean, very few gallery shows, except the biggest, and some exciting ones, but not a lot. New Yorker, Vince Aletti is the gold standard, but he can't go everywhere, and he can't be everywhere, and he isn't everywhere. New York Magazine doesn't really cover, it doesn't review much anymore. I mean, a few big shows. The little blurbs are gone. Time Out, maybe a few. And then we have the art magazines, but they all come out after your show is closed. So I think the absence of critical coverage is a failing of the community, and it happens all the time. I can tell you, I reviewed a William Wegman show today. Early Wegman show up at Craig's Star in 73rd. Fabulous show, you should go see it. It's 1970s, goofy Wegman conceptual brilliance. Not a single review. It's been open since Halloween. Okay? Now tomorrow I'm reviewing a first solo that's been open since early November. No reviews at all. So I think reaction, discussion, feedback, all of that enriches everybody, whether it's positive or negative. We got to have a discussion, people. I mean, that's the way we process work, so we understand what's interesting about it. And we can't let it dissolve down into PR-driven fluff and listings. That's just not anything. It's nothing. So what I'm trying to do with Collector Daily is to write as many reviews as I can write. We need more, not less. We need scale. We need reach. We need to cover more. Because if we don't talk about it, then it just vanishes. And so I'm not purporting to say that the collector's perspective is the valid one. There are plenty of valid ones. It's not academic, it's not curatorial, it's not theoretical, but it's a little better than intuitive. But I think it's no less valid. And what I'm trying to do is pay great, Rick Woodward, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, is starting to write for Collector Daily now. And I'm slowly trying to bring on more writers, and that's clearly, all that is the economic issue of how do we make the math work of paying great writers what they deserve to be paid and still make, not run in the red too far. But I think what I'm really trying to do with Collector Daily is to be a catalyst, to be evangelist, to be passionate, and to try to kind of create excitement around work that isn't getting talked about. Because if it doesn't get talked about, I feel like we're sort of failing. So this year I've reviewed 130 gallery shows, 19 museums. I've reviewed at 89 different venues in the city, 60 different auctions, both previews and results, 27 photo books, which I'm trying to do more. I have been doing sort of one a week, but I'm going to do more, and then 9 art fairs. So now we're going to talk 2 minutes, because I don't have much time, about our collection. So if you haven't figured it out already, I'm kind of a structured thinker. And while there are an infinite number of ways to collect, an infinite number of ways to choose, and of course you can buy what you love, and that works for some people, My wife and I are very much more methodical. Our collection is 3 subject matter areas, so we're subject matter collectors. We collect city and industrial scenes, often abstractions of such. We collect flowers and plants, photographs of flowers and plants, and we collect nudes. The line that kind of connects those 3 things is a formalness, which you'll see in the next page, and it'll become very obvious. And we could call it sort of a modernist vision, but most of what, although we collect from 19th century to contemporary, much of it is modernist photography. So what we do is we're not randomly looking everywhere. We're pretty specific. I mean, the reason Collector Daily came out of my vision of just getting out and seeing everything, and that the way I processed it was writing about it. And that's still what I'm doing as a collector. I write about it to sort of make myself understand what I've seen. So I go out and endlessly look, we hunt, and we are very focused in what we're looking for. We understand the trade-offs. We know how things fit together. We know where a piece fits in the history of photography, in the history of that genre, how it fits, how it connects to other things. When we hang it next to other things, we know what it's going to look like. We make decisions with 2 sets of eyes. I'm still very much the hunter and gatherer. I kind of wander off into the hinterland and bring back the pelt and deliver it at my wife's feet, and she sort of says, eh, or she says it's great, and but.
And you listen to her.
Absolutely. As I was saying to Jaime, nudes are an extremely hard thing to buy with 2 sets of eyes. It's really easy for one of us to like something, but it's really hard for both of us to like it. I could talk to you for a day about the history of floral photography and about what's happened over the last 150 years. Artists from Fox Talbot and Anna Atkins all the way to Mapplethorpe and everything in between, and why things happened and how that history shows us, just inside that one little genre, how photography has changed, how things have evolved, how ideas have been passed, how things have been reused. So here's a sample. So, flowers, you have something like a Bosvelt or a Mapplethorpe, Brandt and Brassai here. That's an Abbott, that's a Callahan, late 40s Callahan. The ones on the right you'll never guess, Minor White on top, Imogen Cunningham, and that's Albert Renger-Patch, a German photographer. This isn't meant to be representative or anything, it's just sort of, here's kind of the kinds of things that are in our collection. And so is this, as I was saying to Jaime, in a different life, I might have been an abstract photography collector. I could imagine building such a collection.
It's such an uncommon Minor White.
Minor White didn't make very many flowers. He only made flowers in 1957 and 1958, and he made tea tree peonies. There's probably 5 or 10.
So that makes that image, Minor White's image, more desirable for you?
Not
Because of its
necessarily. I
unco-
think I think there are photographers who are known for a certain genre, who are great, flower photographers, who are great city scene photographers, who are great whatever photographers. It's also interesting to look at photographers who are not known for being in a genre and seeing how they approach it. And so that's part of why that Minor White is interesting. It's not necessarily that Minor White was the most amazing flower photographer, but when you think about the way he made photographs and his whole sort of spiritual thing he had going on, why did he make those pictures? Why did they come out the way they did? That's interesting to me. And then you look at, okay, that's 1957 or 58. What's happening in the 10 years before that? What is he influenced by? What had he seen? He's obviously not looking at Blossfeld I mean, exactly. I mean, this is too objective and specimen-like. He's mystical minor white. He's doing something different. But so, I mean, if we were to have longer to talk about this, we could understand why these things happen. And I'm going to do one more just to give you an example of the same issue. Here's something we recently bought. This is a Vic Muniz. It's a flower. Vic Muniz didn't make very many flowers, or hasn't made a whole lot of flowers in his career. The ones you probably know are ones where he used pictures of pigment and sort of recreated still life floral arrangements, colorful still life floral arrangements of famous paintings that you might know. The reason we picked this one and we went looking for it was that we sat down with that thick Vic Muniz catalog raisonné, which is like, break your arm. And you open, and we spent a lot of time looking through it. And they're like, okay, so here are the ones that could fit into one of our genres. And we're interested in his work. And so then we start to look at sort of how his career evolves and how he became the sort of Vic Muniz we know now. Where were the transition points in his career? And so you look at about in the early 90s, this is where he starts to make, before that he was, you could argue he was a sculptor. And in the early 90s, he starts to make these first images of string, which we talked about, and wire, where he's making a sculpture to be photographed for the first time, trying to figure it out. And most of these wire pictures are really simple. Very, almost like a line, they're like a line drawing. And so the reason we were interested in this, yes, it's a flower, but also it's kind of representative of what was exciting about Vic Muniz. It's like where he figured out who he was. And yeah, of course, we could have bought a 10-foot by 10-foot crazy, beautiful one of pigments or ripped up magazines or one of the kind he's showing now. But this one, for me, it feels like this is where he came from. This is what's actually interesting. We strip away all the other stuff, all the merchandising and all the big prints and all the famous stuff. This is kind of who he still is. This is where his innovation was, artistically. And so we went looking for it, and we found it, and we bought it. And it wasn't super expensive, because nobody else wants this work. What's that?
How much was it?
I think it was $9,000. And I know that may seem like a lot to some of you, but it's not a lot compared to other things. So that's, I guess the only thing I have left for you here is that soon this window is going to change entirely that we were talking about before. And every one of these little puzzle pieces is now going to be virtual. And we're going to be talking about all of these things happening on screens as opposed to in person. And so I'm trying, I don't know the answer to this one. I haven't figured this out yet. And if you guys have figured it out, I want to hear from you. Because I think, how will we discover and collect photography 20 years from now? That's an interesting question. Not obvious. And it will be like this. And so the question is, how will we still fall in love? I don't know. But that's what I'm thinking about. So that's it. There's my email. Send me an email. Don't be a stranger. I'm not hiding.
We have time for some questions?
Absolutely. Anything.
Would you recommend actual photo books or digital books?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that, as a collector, I will tell you personally, I have never purchased a digital photo book. Would I buy one? Yes. And I had this discussion, about a year ago I had this discussion with someone about, okay, I have an iPad. Why don't I carry around 50 Lee Friedlanders on my iPad the way I carry stuff around on my Kindle? And why don't, when I sit down with Jaime and I say, I love Friedlander, here's some Friedlanders I'd like to show you, why don't I do that? I don't. And so, but why? I don't know anybody who does. I mean, you can see gallery owners who will have a whole bunch of stuff they're trying to sell you on an iPad. But collectors, I don't have my collection on my iPad. I don't collect images the way I collect music. I don't know why I don't do that. And so I don't. So the question is, can I be moved by a digital photo book? I think I can, but I haven't learned how to consume it yet. Although I know how to consume a digital text book, I'm not sure I know how to consume an image book yet, or at least I haven't learned. You're gonna have to teach me. And I realize that's a little bit of dodge, and I'm sorry, but
I was wondering if you ever display any of your collections, like sort of in a gallery setting, but not for sale, just
no.
for the
Well,
public.
so about 5 years ago, we tried to put most of our collection up on the web in an old site called DLK Collection, Diana and Loring Knoblauch, because we're sort of delusionally afraid of people knowing who we were. And the reason we did that is that we felt like a lot of collectors don't ever show what they have. And you can't really figure out where things are or what people are really interested in. And I had a lot of gallery owners who would send me an email and say, here's this lovely Brett Weston landscape that we know you'll love. And I would send them back and say, you just don't have any idea what I'm interested in. I've been telling you that I'm interested in these 3 genres, so don't send me landscapes. They're lovely, perfect for another collector, but they're not perfect for me. And so part of putting this website up was to try to kind of streamline communication. Sort of say, here's what I'm interested in, and you can look at it and you can say, look, there are half a dozen Bill Brandt nudes there. I'm interested in Bill Brandt, so if you've got one, I might be a decent target for showing it to. And we have lent to museum shows that have had a certain, perspective or needed a certain picture for whatever reason. It doesn't happen that often because most of the museums have what they need or can get it easier than trying to track it down from me. And we don't necessarily have anything so like amazingly rare. So would we? I'm one of the more open collectors, I would say. Many are pretty cagey about what they've got or what they're interested in.
You talk about it as if it's, like you said, a collection because you're sort of building it together.
Absolutely.
I could see it. I'm imagining in my head.
Yeah, no, well, and I
See it
think that,
all.
yeah, I mean, it absolutely has a structure and an architecture in our heads and in, crazy spreadsheets that would make you, think I was really, really crazy. Where like every photographer who's ever made a flower picture is on the list and like yes and no and maybe and, I'm interested in this photographer and I'm not interested, I don't need any Helmut Newton nudes, but I do need more of this, or, there is a structure, there is a kind of a grand plan. I am a, quasi kind of curator of my own vision of different genres of photography and what's interesting in them. And so, yes, if I could hang them together or put them together in a book, then I could tell that story, which maybe I will someday.
So it's amazing to see passion from this end of photography, from not the creation but the collector side. So thank you for sharing that with us. My big part of this is the print itself, and so I'm looking.
You're a print junkie.
Print and creation of prints and things like that. But as the object itself, And of course, we're in the digital program, so it's my question is a little bit around: is it anywhere in your thought process or the decision making of what type of print that the actual? Is it a digital C print? Is it a inkjet print?
Sure.
Things like that.
Absolutely. Those issues are real. Those conservation issues, durability issues, absolutely. I think that when when we go back and look at vintage photography, obviously, I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a piece about how hard it was for collectors to understand digital craftsmanship, and to really be able, it's easy. I mean, I think all of us, if I lay down a beautiful Edward Weston print and a crappy one next to each other, we could all look at that and say, there's a major difference. We can see it. We can, and if I didn't even show you the crappy one, you could kind of resonate with the beauty of that print, irrespective of whether you like the subject matter or the content of the picture. You could say, that's some craftsmanship. I see it, I appreciate it, I'm moved by it. In the digital realm, I am still struggling with that. Is how do I discern that mastery from average when I go to a gallery? When I look at a print behind glass, on a wall, spotlit, how do I know, how can I, and I would profess to have a rudimentary knowledge of Photoshop and sort of the effects and things that sharpening and, that could be done. So I can kind of pick out the obvious over-sharpened picture and the obvious, I can kind of see a few things, but I think there's a ton of education of collectors that needs to happen about digital quality and the sort of gradation of digital quality from good to bad. Because I think that very, very few collectors could articulate to you how to see a superlative digital print.
Right. And what's involved, or what that looks
Yeah,
like. Yeah.
I think I really think that, and maybe you could say that that's ignorance on the part of collectors, or you could say it's just the technology is moving so fast that we're not keeping up, and we're getting lost in content and not in craftsmanship as much as we catch up.
Whereas they would have been for more vintage, older.
Well, I
prints.
think that virtually every vintage collector I know is a print junkie.
Right.
Is a print quality connoisseur, and so they're not only looking for the Margaret Bourke White that they've always wanted to have from 1930. They're looking for a great print, and they'll settle for a crappy print if they don't have any other options. If it's, they'll settle for a damaged print. They'll settle for a foxed print, a silvered print, a ripped print. But because there aren't any choices anymore. There are no more prints. They're all in museum collections, and this is the last one. And so if you're in love with this image and it's got a torn corner, you go for it, and you negotiate the price down.
But on the contemporary side.
But on the contemporary side, I think that's hard. I think that's less well understood, is that, I go into the back of a gallery and I'm interested in some image, and so now I've got 5 copies of it that have been printed out on the flat file. How do I pick the one that's the best? Not obvious, at least to me.
Right. That's correct.
So
We don't have you here every night. I'm dying to ask you a question. Sorry, bear with me.
no,
When there's big money at stake, collecting is not a stranger to controversy. And I was wondering if you could weigh in on the whole Eggleston digital editions, or if you wrote for the blog.
So I did. I wrote about this. And so, what I would say about the Eggleston, so for those of you who don't, do you understand, do you all know what this is about?
Do the synopsis.
So, Eggleston made dye transfer prints for the vast majority of his career. None of them larger than maybe 16 by 20, mostly maybe 11 by 14. beautiful prints, luscious color, in small editions. And so, I think it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, he decided to make digital, I think they were pigment prints, 40 by 60. Sold them at Christie's, direct, no gallery, straight into the market. My first reaction, and I wrote this, was that I thought it was a complete sellout. I thought it was a scam. I mean, in the kind of, here's a well-known artist. He's just milking this because he can make the money. Really, I mean, that was really my first reaction, and I still have a little bit of that reaction, to be honest. But what I will say is that when I went and looked at the prints, they were terrific. And there were two groups of pictures, in my view. There were the obvious pictures. There was the tricycle and the red ceiling and the green shower and pictures you would expect and are kind of iconic already. What I thought was really more interesting than seeing those big, and it does change to see them bigger. I mean, it's a different feel to see that red ceiling at that scale than to see it at this scale. It's a different viewing experience. I think what I was more interested in was that he had picked a bunch of other very less known Egglestons that had been printed big, that were really well chosen to be big. There was a great one of like a doorknob with a reflection in it that at that scale was just fabulous, but at 11 by 14 would have been sort of ho-hum. And so, I kind of had a mixed feeling of like, part of me feels like this is a kind of a grab for the cash. It's a way to make it contemporary art by printing it bigger and selling it to a different set of collectors, not the vintage collectors. And there aren't very many of these great vintage Egglestons running around anymore, and so it's a way to make a bunch of money and put it into his trust and help him, preserve his legacy. So fair enough. But I was actually more interested in those ones that weren't obvious, and that like, hey, he had really, somebody, whether it was he or someone else in his family, had kind of thought it through and said, actually these pictures will function in an interesting manner large. And so, I mean, they sold well. They sold extremely well. It was a white glove, sell everything, sell, big prices. And actually there's a Gagosian show up now of Eggleston clouds, blue cloud. He made these pictures in the late 70s. Wedgwood Blue. They were in a book called Wedgwood Blue, and they're printed big too. And again, they're different. Don't know if I didn't actually love them. Thought they were a little bit confectionery, but they were okay big. So I'm sort of on the fence. I still feel I don't know. I think, I mean, he was taken to court, as you realize, by some of the collectors who held the smaller prints and felt like there was an implicit argument that the editions could never be bigger, and if he's making a red ceiling at 40 by 50, is it breaking that sort of contract if there were only going to ever be 5? I actually don't hold with that so much. I sort of feel like artists have the right to make pictures at different sizes and reinterpret their work. I don't have a hard time with him making new pictures. I just felt like it was a little bit kind of a crass commercial thing, more than it was necessarily inherently evil.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren, for great talk.